Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It is my pleasure to rise and speak to Bill 10 today, red tape statutes amendment or reductions or whatever. Anyway, I'm going to these omnibus bills are, the names are always so creative. I want to sort of speak to the changes that allow the creation of cervid harvest preserves first. So these are areas where the shooting of trophy elk and deer in high fenced enclosures will be permitted. There could be other species involved as well. This is a highly controversial idea, Mr. Speaker, with a high level of disagreement amongst stakeholders, and robust public consultation is the bare minimum of what the Agricultural Minister should have done on this topic. But there has been no public or stakeholder consultation on this recently, and there is no evidence of a review of the wildlife science literature and analysis either, and I find that disappointing. The other thing that's disappointing is that these changes are hidden in a Red Tape Reduction Act, so it's not even coming to the legislature floor in its own act, warranting the fulsome debate that it deserves. Statutes to protect the public interest and wildlife are definitely in the public interest, Mr. Speaker, and are not red tape. The amendments to the Livestock Industry Diversification Act are ill-advised and frankly reckless. For weeks, I have been fielding many emails from fish and game associations and other hunting groups stating their opposition to the idea of cervid harvest preserves. These are people, Mr. Speaker, who traditionally vote UCP or Conservative, but their votes are now at risk, their words, not mine, because of this decision. In one email to the Premier, a constituent commented that hunters will be watching how MLAs vote on this issue. This proposal to allow CHPs, or cervid harvest preserves, has been rejected multiple times in Alberta's recent history. In 2001, Premier Klein called it abhorrent before rejecting the proposal. And current cabinet ministers that still sit in this room every day have also spoken out against this idea when they were agricultural ministers. So it's kind of interesting to me that it should come up now. The Alliance for Public Wildlife calls this move preposterous and absurd. Attempts to expand or propose larger, more natural areas on marginal land to stimulate real hunting, even though this still isn't real hunting, will only further fragment and destroy prime wildlife habitat and facilitate transfer of diseases, parasites, and invasive species. The Alberta Wildlife Federation has spoken out about these changes, Mr. Speaker. They represent more than 14,000 Albertans and oppose this bill because it conflicts with the North American model of wildlife management. An independent survey of Albertans found that 72% expressed opposition to CHPs, concern that decisions regarding this issue should be made with open, transparent public education and consultation, which, as I said, has not happened. Their members who are game ranchers are terrified of the risks associated with buying cheap feed from the Wainwright area due to CWD contamination, and especially so on grain crops that sat out for the winter and were fed on by infected mule deer. And I'll get a little bit more into CWD shortly here. In partnership with hunting and fishing organizations, the Minister of Forestry and Parks and the Minister of Infrastructure have been invited to participate in community discussions about this, where both the pros and the cons could be discussed in multi-stakeholder conversations. Both of those ministers did not get back to their constituents consistently or in time for such an event to be organized. And as one member told me, real hunters don't pretend to hunt domesticated animals, and responsible governments listen to their constituents. The Wildlife Society, an international organization of scientists and managers advancing wildlife management, says the list of impacts associated with hunt farms includes behavioral impacts on farm species, diseases associated with confinement and transport, genetic effects of confinement, shipment across natural ranges, habitat impacts, impacts on non-target species, and exclusion of wild animals from critical or migratory habitats. As a public resource, wildlife has a presumed right to pass freely through private lands with protection from ill-advised barriers or threats. This is necessary for migration, forage, habitat, and escape. All of this is lost when second fences are erected or when game farms are erected in the first place. So there are two main reasons for opposition to cervid harvest preserves. First is the argument of fair chase, and second is the reality of chronic wasting disease. Fair chase is defined by the Boone and Crockett Club as the ethical, sportsmanlike, and lawful pursuit and taking of any free-ranging wild animal in a manner that does not give the hunter an improper or unfair advantage over game animals. The Minister of Forestry and Parks spoke repeatedly to this idea of fair chase last spring when we were debating the Wildlife Amendment Act. It's one of the few things the Minister of Forestry and Parks and I can agree on. Hunting in a cervid harvest preserve is not hunting or harvest. This is shooting a captive animal enclosed in an escape-proof fence without any of the classic rules of fair chase. Ethical hunting is rooted in stewardship, respect for wildlife, and a connection to the land. This action actually debases hunting, Mr. Speaker. I've received emails from hunters who are concerned about what cervid harvest preserves do for the reputation of hunters in society. Because ethical hunting uses a combination of skill, observation, time, and maybe a little bit of luck to be successful. Respecting nature and building a relationship with it is an essential part of a successful hunt. Stepping into a fenced enclosure involves little of these essential components and degrades hunting in the public eye. This has very real potential to tarnish ethical, responsible hunters who are proud to be responsible stewards of Alberta's wild places and its wildlife. The second concern, Mr. Speaker, is chronic wasting disease. CWD is an incurable, always fatal degeneration of the brain. It is a prion disease in the same family as Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease and bovine spongiform encephalopathy, or BSC, mad cow disease. As a biologist, there are two things in this world, Mr. Speaker, that truly scare the pants off me: climate change and CWD. CWD is pervasive, it spreads rampantly, it kills all deer and elk in its wake, and is a disease introduced to this world through human activities. CWD is the worst of the prion diseases because it can be transmitted by body fluids or infected animals and can spread to and through wild ungulate herds. The prions that source the infection are virtually indestructible. I have yet to find a paper that has described actual successful destruction of CWD. And it can persist in the environment for years. There is no going back from CWD spreading on the landscape. In addition to animal-to-animal transmission, research suggests prions shed from infected animals can remain in the soil and in the water for long periods of time. This provides opportunity for the disease to repeatedly cycle through new animals and new generations. While the origins of CWD are not entirely known, research suggests it moved from sheep to deer in farmed settings in the U.S. It then came to Saskatchewan through farmed ungulate imports, was transmitted to wild deer, and came to Alberta. To date, 16 elk farms in Alberta are contaminated with CWD. Every year, I look at the Alberta government website and map of CWD spread, and every year CWD has spread farther and more rapidly than biologists estimated. To be clear, CWD started on wild game farms. Having wild ungulates feeding at stations in high density and in pens is what led to the evolution of the disease. CWD is now the largest ever mass of infectious prions in global history. It cannot be mitigated or cured. Its potential impacts to wild deer and elk populations are severe, risking population viability, and so the future of wild deer and elk hunting, as well as everything else. CWD and cervid harvest preserves are deeply intertwined. CHPs involve transporting and confining farmed deer and elk into fenced enclosures for hunting, which significantly increases risk of spreading CWD. Recommendations are to contain the spread of CWD by enacting and enforcing an immediate ban on the movement of all live cervids. The highest level of CWD infections, persistence, and geographical transfer have been found on commercial game farms. Legalizing CHPs would amplify this risk by concentrating animals in confined areas, increasing animal-to-animal contact, and accelerating environmental contamination. CWD seems to be unstoppable, a slow-moving pathological train wreck. It fits the definition of a wicked problem, which is defined as something that is difficult or impossible to solve because of incomplete, contradictory, and shifting factors that are often difficult to recognize. Research shows devastating impacts on wildlife with severe population declines to the point of extirpation or extinction of deer, elk, caribou, and potentially moose, with massive ecosystems, economic, food security, treaty, and trade consequences. We have allowed hunting for some species on other game farms, namely wild boar, and that has been a total disaster. Wild boar are now successfully infiltrating much of Alberta and Saskatchewan, and some have classified wild boar as the most dangerous invasive species in the country. This government talks about invasive mussels and all their success there. Wild boar is way worse and will cost way more money, and it all starts with inappropriate game hunting on farms. Efforts to date around CWD have mostly been to monitor the spread, provide awareness, and learn as much as possible by supporting CWD research. Hunters are required to submit heads for testing from selective wildlife management units. There are recommendations on how to consume and how to process elk and deer in these areas. So we recognize that CWD is dangerous. We recognize it's spreading quickly. We recognize that measures have to be taken to contain it. And yet here we are talking about doing the very thing that will propagate the spread of honestly what is the most dangerous disease to ungulate populations in the province. Environmental contamination on infected hunt farms cannot be eliminated, so prions build up in the soils and remain infectious. These issues in part explain why the Canadian Food Inspection Agency backed away from their national approach to eliminating CWD in game farms. And we now have to live with the cost and persistence of CWD, but we definitely should not be doing things that exacerbate it. The minister will say that the elk farming industry needs to remain economically viable, and they need to allow harvest preserves in order to do that. I want us to have a very serious conversation about how we ensure that people who run elk farms do not go out of business. Obviously, I don't want that to happen to anybody, but I do not think this is the solution. There is no legitimate purpose to promote, exploit captive wildlife as industry, and records show that these kinds of schemes have turned out to be exactly as predicted, a biological nightmare and an economic deficit machine. Allowing cervid hunting on game farms will not save the elk farming industry, Mr. Speaker. It could make their lives more difficult. With my remaining minute and a half, I want to talk a little bit about the licensed citizenship markers, because I don't like that either. And adding these markers to licenses is unnecessary and, to be honest, a little offensive. I was thinking a little about when I've pulled my driver's license out as proof of my identification lately, Mr. Speaker. I've used it at the bank, at the hospital or doctor's office, not at the bar like my member from Edmonton Gold Bar, who clearly is so much more younger than I am, but I've also used it when registering my vehicle. And none of those purposes needed to know that I'm a citizen. I can't think of why it would even matter. Anyone can have a bank account, see a doctor, or drive a car. It's an invasion of my privacy, and for anyone, including a bouncer at a bar, to see my citizenship, it's none of their business. Other than voting, there are no programs exclusive to citizens, and there are other ways to prove voter eligibility. So I echo the question that many of my colleagues have asked, which is, what programs are going to be restricted to people who are not citizens that we need to have this marker on our licenses? Where does that matter? Because to me, on this side of the House, what it looks like to me is opening the door to discrimination. It's a way of creating the other, and it's a way of allowing people to discriminate against you before you even have a conversation. Thank you.